Hello everyone, and welcome to Creepy Comfort. I know many of you use these videos to sleep, so before you slip into dreams, let me know where you're listening from in the comments below. If you're enjoying the content, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now get comfortable and relax, and let's begin. There's a stretch of road between my hometown and the city where I now live. A desolate two-lane highway that cuts through an endless expanse of forest. Locals call it the Hollow. It's a name that doesn't make sense geographically. It isn't a valley or lowland, but somehow it fits. Something about that road feels emptied out, like it's missing something vital. I had driven that road countless times, but it wasn't until last November that I truly noticed it. It was late, past midnight, and the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that stings your lungs. I was heading home after visiting my parents. The radio turned low to keep me company. The forest on either side of me was dense, the kind of dark that seemed to press against the car windows. Somewhere around mile marker 46, I saw it for the first time. A figure stood at the edge of the road, barely illuminated by my headlights. It wasn't moving, just standing there, half hidden by the trees. My heart stuttered, and I slowed down instinctively. As I passed, I realized it wasn't a person at all. It was a shape. Humanoid, yes, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I didn't dare stop, but my eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. The figure was gone. By the time I reached home, I had convinced myself it was a trick of the light. Shadows can play cruel games when you're alone in the dark. But the next time I drove that road, it happened again. The following weekend, I found myself driving along the hollow again. The sky was moonless, the darkness so thick it felt like my headlights barely cut through it. I kept telling myself I wouldn't look for it, that I'd keep my eyes on the road, but my curiosity betrayed me. Around mile marker 46, my breath hitched. There it was again. The same figure, motionless at the tree line. It was closer this time, close enough that the high beams caught the texture of its skin, if you could call it that. It was pale and mottled, like the bark of a dying tree. This time I didn't slow down. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator, and I sped past, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I couldn't help myself, though. I looked in the rearview mirror. It had stepped onto the road. Not walking, not running, just there. Closer than before. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it standing in the road, its head tilted, as though it were listening. Over the next week, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I scoured the internet for anything about the Hollow. Local legends, urban myths, ghost stories. There were vague mentions of disappearances along that stretch of road, but nothing concrete. No one else seemed to have seen what I had. But there was one post that stood out, buried in a forgotten thread on a backwater forum. If you see it, don't stop. Don't slow down. And for God's sake, don't look back. By the time I drove through the hollow again, the air felt different. Heavier, colder. The kind of cold that sinks into your bones no matter how high the heat is in your car. I told myself I wouldn't look. I wouldn't give it the satisfaction. But when I reached mile marker 46, I couldn't help it. It was standing in the middle of the road. This time I got a clear look at it. Its face, or what should have been a face, was blank, a smooth expanse of pale, mottled flesh. Its limbs dangled unnaturally, like a marionette with its strings cut. And then it moved, not towards me, but around me. One moment it was in front of the car. The next, it was beside me, its featureless head level with my window. The only thing I remember after that is slamming on the gas and not letting up until I was clear of the hollow. I couldn't avoid that road forever. It was the fastest route between home and the city, and avoiding it would mean hours of detours. So I decided to confront it. The next time I drove through, I came prepared. A camera mounted on the dashboard, a flashlight within reach, and my phone set to record. I told myself that if I saw it again, I'd stop and face it, prove to myself it wasn't real. But when I reached mile marker 46, the road was empty. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by unease. Maybe it was gone, or maybe it was waiting. And then the car stopped. Not sputtered, not stalled, just stopped. The engine cut out, the lights died, and the heater fell silent. I sat there, the darkness pressing in on me, my breath fogging up the cold glass. I reached for the flashlight with trembling hands, but before I could turn it on, something tapped on the driver's side window. 3 slow, deliberate taps. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My fingers froze on the flashlight as the taps came again, sharp and deliberate. I turned my head slowly, afraid of what I'd see. The window was frosted over, but I could make out a shape on the other side. Tall, unmoving, tapped again, louder this time. The flashlight felt heavy in my hand as I fumbled with the switch. When the beam finally cut through the darkness, I aimed it at the window. There was nothing there, but the fog on the glass told a different story. 3 streaks ran down the pane, as if someone or something had dragged their fingers through the condensation. I forced myself to breathe. My rational mind screamed for explanations. A prank? A trick of the wind? Anything to make sense of this. But deep down, I knew better. The car jolted violently, as if something had slammed into it from behind. My heart leapt into my throat. I twisted around, flashlight in hand, but the back seat was empty. And then the tapping started again, on the rear window this time. I shone the flashlight toward the sound, and for the briefest moment, I saw it. The same figure, crouched low, its long, gangly arms pressed against the glass. Its head was tilted as if trying to see me more clearly, though it had no eyes. Then it moved. It didn't walk or crawl. It shifted, like a shadow dragged across the surface of a wall. 1 second it was at the back window, and the next it was at the passenger side. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. All I could do was reach for the keys, my trembling hands barely able to grip them. The engine roared to life, and I floored the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, the tires spinning on the icy road, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare look back. By the time I reached the edge of the forest, the sun was starting to rise. The pale light felt surreal, like I'd driven into another world. My hands were still shaking when I pulled into my driveway, and I sat there for a long time, trying to convince myself it was over. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I avoided the hollow for weeks after that. I took the longer route, added hours to my trips, anything to avoid that stretch of road. But no matter how hard I tried to forget, it lingered in the back of my mind. The tapping, the streaks on the glass, the figure that seemed to defy reality. Then, last night, I woke to the sound of tapping on my bedroom window. 3 slow, deliberate taps, My house is nowhere near the hollow. I live in a suburban neighborhood, surrounded by manicured lawns and streetlights. There's no reason anyone or anything should be at my window in the dead of night. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stared at the window, half expecting to see those streaks again. But the glass was clear. Then I heard it, a faint, familiar sound, like the creak of branches swaying in the wind. Except there was no wind, and it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the hallway. I sat frozen in bed, my ears straining against the oppressive silence. The sound came again, a soft creak, deliberate and rhythmic, like footsteps on old wooden boards. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but it wasn't there. The realization sent a jolt of panic through me. I distinctly remembered setting it down before I went to sleep. The creaking grew louder, closer, as if something was moving toward my room. My mind raced with impossible thoughts, every instinct screaming for me to run. But where would I go? And then the tapping started again, on the door this time. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I couldn't bring myself to speak, couldn't bring myself to move. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps as the doorknob began to turn. It didn't creak or rattle. It turned smoothly, deliberately, as if whoever was on the other side wanted me to know they were coming. The door opened a crack, and I saw it. The figure. It didn't step into the room. It didn't need to. Its presence filled the space, an overwhelming, suffocating force that made the air feel thick and cold. Its blank face seemed to lean forward, as though studying me, and for the first time, I heard its voice. Except it wasn't a voice. It was a whisper, 1,000 voices speaking at once, overlapping and incomprehensible, like a language I wasn't meant to understand. And then it stopped. The figure straightened, its head tilting ever so slightly, and with one fluid motion it was gone. The door swung shut, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When the sun rose, I searched my house from top to bottom, every closet, every corner, every shadow. There was no sign of it. But when I stepped outside, I found something on my car windshield, a single streak in the frost, as though someone had dragged their finger across the glass. I haven't driven through the hollow since. I've avoided it at all costs, taken every detour imaginable. But I know it doesn't matter, because whatever was in the hollow, it's here now, and I don't think it plans to leave. Our next tale takes us deeper into the unknown. Story 2. It started with the smell. Faint at first, like a distant campfire carried on the breeze. But as the days passed, it grew stronger, more acrid, until the scent of burning wood and charred flesh seemed to cling to everything in my home. I live alone in a small, unassuming house on the edge of town, the kind of place people drive past without a second thought. It's quiet, surrounded by fields and trees, the perfect escape from the chaos of the city, or so I thought. The smell began in the basement. I noticed it one evening when I went down to grab a box of winter clothes. As I descended the creaking wooden stairs, the air grew heavier, thicker, tinged with that unmistakable, bitter scent of smoke. I checked the furnace, the wiring, even the small pile of firewood I kept for my stove. Everything was intact, no sign of fire or heat, but the smell lingered, sharp and invasive, as though it was woven into the very fabric of the house. That night, I dreamed of flames. The walls of my bedroom seemed to melt away, replaced by roaring fire and swirling smoke. I stood in the center of it all, untouched but suffocating, unable to move or scream. And just beyond the flames, I saw something moving, a shadow tall and gaunt, its eyes glowing like embers. When I woke, the smell was stronger than ever. The next day, I called the fire department. They searched the entire house, top to bottom, but found nothing. No signs of fire, no faulty wiring, no gas leaks, nothing to explain the pervasive stench. "You're lucky," one of them said as he packed up his gear. "But if I were you, I'd keep an eye on that basement. Old houses like this, sometimes they've got a way of hiding things." That night, the dreams came again. This time, I wasn't alone. I was in the basement, surrounded by piles of ash that shifted and swirled as though alive. And in the center of the room, something crouched low to the ground. Its body was charred and twisted, its skin blackened and cracked like burnt wood. When it turned its head toward me, its mouth opened in a soundless scream, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. I woke drenched in sweat, my throat raw as though I had been screaming in my sleep. By the third night, the smell had become unbearable. Clung to my clothes, my hair, even my skin. Every breath tasted like smoke, acrid and suffocating. I had to do something. I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the basement. The air grew colder with every step I took, my breath fogging in the beam of light. The smell was overwhelming now, so thick it made my eyes water. At first, I thought the floor was covered in dirt, but when I knelt down and touched it, my fingers came away coated in ash. And then I heard it, a faint crackling sound, like wood popping and splitting in a fire. It was coming from the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed darker, heavier. As I approached, the crackling grew louder, deeper, until it sounded like the roar of an unseen blaze. My flashlight flickered, the beam cutting in and out, and for the briefest moment, I saw it again. The figure from my dreams. It stood in the corner, its body contorted and blackened, smoke rising from its shoulders. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its mouth opened wide in a soundless scream. And then the light went out. For a moment, I was plunged into total darkness. My heart pounded so loudly it drowned out the crackling sound. I fumbled with the flashlight, shaking it desperately until the beam sputtered back to life. The figure was gone, but the ash wasn't. It began to swirl around me, a slow, deliberate motion, as if the air itself was alive. The flashlight beam cut through the haze, revealing something I hadn't noticed before. A faint outline in the wall. A door. The crackling noise grew louder as I approached, my every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But something compelled me forward, an unnatural pull that I couldn't resist. The door was small and unassuming, its wood charred and splintered, as though it had been exposed to a great fire. I reached out, my hand trembling, and pressed against it. It opened with a low groan, revealing a narrow, blackened tunnel that seemed to stretch endlessly into the earth. The smell of smoke and decay hit me like a wave, making my stomach churn. And then I heard it, a voice, faint and broken, echoing from deep within the tunnel. "Help me!" Against all reason, I stepped inside. The walls of the tunnel were lined with jagged wood and stone, the remnants of something old and forgotten. The ash grew thicker with every step I took, clinging to my shoes and filling the air with a choking haze. The voice called out again, closer this time. "Help me!" It sounded distorted, like it was being dragged through layers of static. My flashlight beam flickered, revealing strange markings on the walls. Symbols I didn't recognize, carved deep into the blackened wood. And then I saw it. At the end of the tunnel was a room, circular and impossibly large, its walls scorched and covered in ash. In the center of the room stood a figure, tall, skeletal, and wreathed in smoke. It wasn't the same as the thing I'd seen in my dreams. This one was worse. Its body seemed to shift and ripple, the edges of its form dissolving into the air like embers in the wind. Its head tilted unnaturally as it regarded me, its eyes glowing with a deep, molten red. "Help me," it said again, but this time the words came from its mouth. I froze, unable to look away as it stepped closer. Its movements were slow, deliberate, each step sending waves of heat and ash through the room. And then it spoke again. "You opened the door. You let me out." The realization hit me like a blow to the chest. Whatever this thing was, it had been trapped here, sealed away for a reason. And I had set it free. It reached out with one long, blackened hand, its fingers curling as if to grasp me. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But it didn't stop. The heat became unbearable, the air thick with ash and smoke. My vision blurred as the room seemed to close in around me, the walls twisting and warping like they were alive. And then, with a deafening roar, everything went black. I woke up in my bed, my clothes drenched in sweat and my lungs burning as if I'd been breathing smoke. The smell was gone, and the house was silent. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But when I went to the basement, the door was gone. The wall was smooth, unbroken, with no sign that it had ever existed. But I know the truth. Whatever I released that night, it's still out there. And sometimes, late at night, I catch a faint whiff of smoke in the air, a warning or a promise. Now, let us venture further into the unknown. Story 3. The fog rolled in thicker than I'd ever seen before. It cloaked the entire neighborhood, swallowing streetlights and houses in its ghostly embrace. From my living room window, the world outside looked like something out of a dream or a nightmare. I live in a small coastal town where fog is a frequent visitor. But this was different. It didn't drift in from the sea as it usually did, light and fleeting. This fog was heavy, oppressive, clinging to the ground like it had a purpose. The clock struck midnight when I heard the first whisper. It was faint, barely audible over the hum of my refrigerator. A single, soft syllable that sounded like my name. "Claire?" I froze, my breath hitching in my chest. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by the eerie stillness outside. But then it came again, louder this time. "Claire?" The sound seemed to seep through the walls, echoing in a way that shouldn't have been possible. I turned off the TV and listened, straining my ears. And then I heard it, the faint shuffle of footsteps just outside my front door. I crept to the window, careful not to make a sound, and peeked through the curtains. The fog was so dense I could barely make out the porch light, its glow muted and weak. But then I saw a figure. It was standing at the edge of my yard, barely visible through the haze. Its outline was vague, shifting, as though the fog was part of its form. "Hello!" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. I grabbed my phone and dialed the non-emergency line for the local police. The dispatcher assured me they'd send someone to check it out, but deep down, I knew they wouldn't find anything. The figure had already disappeared by the time I hung up. The whispers continued throughout the night. They came from every corner of the house, soft and insistent, always saying my name. I tried to drown them out with music, but the sound seeped through, as though it were coming from inside my own head. By dawn, the fog hadn't lifted. I left for work, hoping the routine would shake off the unease, but the fog followed me. It clung to the streets, the parking lot, even the windows of my office. And then, during my lunch break, I saw it again. The figure. It was standing across the street, shrouded in fog, its form barely distinguishable from the mist around it. But this time it was closer, too close. When I got home that evening, I locked every door and window, double-checking each one until my fingers ached. But it didn't matter. The whispers started again as soon as the sun went down. They were louder now, more persistent, and no longer confined to saying my name. "Let us in. Come outside." The words twisted in my mind, filling me with a dread so profound I could barely think. And then the footsteps started again, slow and deliberate, circling my house. I turned off all the lights and hid in my bedroom, clutching my phone like a lifeline. And that's when I realized I wasn't alone. The realization hit me like a jolt of electricity. My bedroom wasn't safe, not anymore. The whispers were inside the house now. "Let us in." I pressed myself against the wall, my phone shaking in my hands. My first instinct was to call the police again, but something told me they wouldn't be able to help me. Whatever this was, it wasn't something they could handle. The air grew colder, thick and damp, as though the fog outside had seeped through the walls. My breath came in shallow gasps, each one visible in the freezing air. And then I heard it, the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. I didn't dare move, my eyes fixed on the darkened doorway. The fog spilled in like water, curling along the floor and creeping toward me. "Come outside." The voice was clearer now, no longer a whisper. It was low and guttural, reverberating through the room. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt like it was filled with ice. The figure stepped into the room, its outline still hazy, blending into the fog that surrounded it. It moved with an unnatural grace, gliding rather than walking, and the closer it came, the harder it was to breathe. "Why me?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely audible. The figure tilted its head, as though pondering my question. "You opened the door," it said, its voice echoing like 1,000 whispers layered on top of one another. "You let us in." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "I didn't." "Not tonight," it interrupted, "but before. You don't remember, do you?" I racked my brain, desperate to make sense of its words. And then, like a flash of lightning, the memory came rushing back. 2 years ago, a camping trip with friends. We had found an old, dilapidated cabin hidden deep in the woods. Inside, we discovered strange carvings on the walls, symbols that none of us could understand. And the door, it had been locked, but curiosity got the better of us. We forced it open, laughing nervously as we joked about unleashing ancient spirits. But there had been something behind that door, something dark and restless. I remembered the way the air had changed, growing heavy and suffocating. I remembered the whispers that followed us back to our tents that night, and I remembered the fog. "It was you," the figure said, its voice growing sharper. "You brought us here. You opened the way." I sank to the floor, my mind racing. This was my fault. Whatever I had unleashed that night had followed me, waiting for its moment to strike. "What do you want from me?" I whispered. The figure leaned closer, its face inches from mine. For the first time, I could see its features, sharp, angular, and inhuman, its eyes burning like twin embers. "Everything," it said simply. The room exploded into chaos. The fog surged forward, engulfing me in its icy grip. I felt myself being pulled, dragged toward the doorway by an invisible force. The whispers grew deafening, overlapping into a cacophony of voices, each one demanding something different. "Let us in. Give us your soul. Join us." I clawed at the floor, desperate to resist, but the fog was relentless. My vision blurred, the world around me dissolving into gray. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. I was lying on the floor, gasping for air. The fog was gone, the whispers silenced. My bedroom was exactly as it had been before, as though nothing had happened. But I knew better. The figure's words echoed in my mind. "You opened the way," and now it was only a matter of time before they came for me again. The days that followed felt like a fog of their own. I went through the motions, work, errands, sleep, yet something was always just off. The air felt heavier, the silence too thick. The whispers had stopped, but the feeling of being watched never left. I couldn't shake the sense that something was lurking just beyond the corner of my vision, waiting for me to look the other way. Each night, as I lay in bed, I could feel the familiar cold creeping in at the edges of my room. The chill that had once been confined to the fog now seemed to bleed into the very walls of my house, a constant, oppressive presence. It was only a matter of time before it would return. I could feel it, like a heartbeat in the background of my life, pulsing in the dark. Then, one evening, as I sat alone in the living room, the fog returned. It wasn't like before. This time, it came in waves, creeping through the cracks in the window as if it had a purpose, a direction. It wrapped itself around me, curling up at my feet, winding its way around the furniture, and filling the room with a dense, choking cloud. I stood up, heart racing. The door was locked, the windows sealed shut. There was no reason for the fog to be here, but it was. I could feel the whispers again, faint but growing louder. They seemed to come from all directions. No longer a single voice, they had multiplied, overlapping in a disorienting chorus that made my skin crawl. "Claire," a cold, icy hand brushed against my skin, sending a wave of panic through me. I tried to run, to get to the door, but the fog clung to me, holding me in place. The temperature dropped to unbearable levels, my breath coming out in short, visible bursts. The whispers grew sharper, more insistent, more familiar. "Let us in," and then, as if summoned by my fear, the figure appeared again, materializing from the fog like a shadow made flesh. It was no longer a vague shape. but a full, grotesque presence, towering over me with eyes that glowed red, hollow, and burning. "You thought you were safe," it hissed, its voice no longer distorted but pure, like it was speaking directly into my soul. "Did you think we would forget?" I tried to back away, but the fog tightened around me, its grip unyielding. "No more hiding," the figure growled. "The door is open. You cannot close it again." I fell to my knees, unable to move, my mind a swirl of terror and disbelief. I remembered the night at the cabin, the door I shouldn't have opened, the symbols we had mocked, the fog that had followed us home. It had never really left. The figure reached down, its fingers cold as they brushed across my face. It felt like the touch of death itself, leaving a trail of icy terror in its wake. "This is your doing, Claire," it whispered, its breath rancid and foul. "You invited us in." I gasped, the air thin, my chest tight. The walls of the room seemed to close in on me, the fog suffocating, the whispers deafening. I closed my eyes, bracing for what I knew was coming. And then, with a snap of my thoughts, I remembered. The key. The key that had been buried under the floorboards of the old cabin. It was said to lock and unlock the door between worlds. But I had never used it, never thought I would need to. I had to find it. I had to close the door. The world around me shifted, blurring like the fog itself. And in that moment, I made a choice. With all my strength, I pushed the figure back, breaking free from the fog's grip, and stumbled toward the door. The whispers reached a crescendo, shrieking my name, pleading with me to stay, but I ran. I don't know how I made it to the cabin or how I found the key beneath the rotting floorboards. All I know is that I had it in my hand when I returned to my house, standing at the threshold of my front door. The fog was waiting for me, but this time I had the key. With trembling hands, I inserted it into the door's lock, turning it slowly, feeling the weight of the world press down on me as I did. The whispers intensified, the figure emerging from the fog, reaching toward me, desperate to stop me. And then, with a final twist, the lock clicked. The fog vanished. The figure dissolved into the air, its presence fading as if it had never existed. I stood in silence, panting, holding the key in my hand. The door was closed, for now. Story 4. It started with a simple invitation. The envelope arrived on a quiet Thursday afternoon, plain and unmarked, except for a single elegant gold seal stamped in the shape of an eye. No return address, no name. I should have ignored it. I should have torn it up and thrown it in the trash. But something about it intrigued me. I ran my fingers over the seal, the smooth surface gleaming faintly in the dim light of my apartment. Inside, a single card white with a simple, elegant script. "You are invited to the exhibition of the unseen." I read it over and over, trying to make sense of it. My curiosity was piqued, but my instincts told me to stay away. There was something off about the whole thing, something that twisted in the back of my mind. But the lure of the unknown won out. The invitation included an address, tucked in the corner of the card, and with a mix of excitement and unease, I decided to go. The gallery was located on a narrow street I'd never noticed before, hidden between old, crumbling buildings. It was an odd location, so out of place, as though the street didn't belong in the city. The air felt heavier here, thick with the weight of something ancient and forgotten. I walked into the gallery, and immediately, a wave of cold washed over me. The entire place was dimly lit, with only the soft flicker of antique lamps casting long shadows on the walls. The room was lined with portraits, but they weren't just any portraits. Each one was different. Each one featured a person, frozen in time, their eyes wide with terror, their faces contorted into expressions of pure, unadulterated fear. Some were blurred, others cracked and damaged, but all of them seemed to follow me as I moved deeper into the room. I shivered. A man stepped out from the shadows, his movements smooth, almost too fluid. His black suit was impeccable, his face pale, with dark circles under his eyes. "Welcome to the exhibition," he said in a voice as cold and calculated as the air around me. "We are honored to have you." I nodded, though I wasn't sure what I had gotten myself into. "Are you here to witness the collection?" he asked, his voice laced with a strange excitement. I didn't answer immediately. Something about his demeanor sent a chill up my spine. The man's eyes glinted, as if he already knew my response. I followed him deeper into the gallery. He led me to a small, secluded room at the back of the building, where a large velvet curtain covered a framed piece. The room was silent, except for the faintest whisper of movement. The man pulled back the curtain with a flourish, revealing a large, ornate mirror. But this wasn't just any mirror. The glass was dark, almost liquid, and it shimmered with an unsettling glow. I stepped forward, drawn to it. In the reflection, I saw myself, but something was wrong. The image in the mirror wasn't a perfect reflection. It was distorted, the edges blurred, as though the glass was pulling at the very fabric of reality itself. I leaned closer, my breath fogging up the glass, and then I saw them. Faces, not my own, not anyone I recognized. There were dozens of them, pale, featureless faces, staring back at me from the depths of the mirror. They were trapped, their eyes wide and pleading, their mouths silently screaming. I stumbled backward, heart racing. The man stood beside me, watching with a twisted smile. "They are the collector's pieces," he explained softly. "Captured souls, stolen from their bodies, preserved for eternity in the glass. Every person who has ever stared into the mirror becomes part of the collection. Their fear, their agony, it lives on, trapped in this reflection." I backed away from the mirror, but my feet felt like lead. Couldn't look away. The faces in the mirror seemed to be reaching for me, clawing at the surface, desperate to escape. "You," I gasped, struggling to form the words. "You've taken them?" "All of them." The man nodded, his smile widening. "I am the collector. It is my art, my masterpiece." I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. The faces in the mirror blurred together, merging into one indistinguishable mass, their eyes following my every movement. And then the reflection shifted. One of the faces, the closest to the surface, smiled. It was a smile full of malice, full of the same dark joy I saw in the collector's eyes. It reached out, its fingers curling, and in that moment, I realized I was next. The door slammed shut behind me, and I turned to see the man standing there, his hands clasped in front of him, watching me with amusement. "You're quite the specimen, you know," he said softly. "But fear, true fear, that is the most beautiful thing. And it's yours to give." I shook my head, frantic now. The mirror was calling to me, pulling me in. The faces blurred again, a swirling vortex of despair, reaching, clawing, wanting me. I backed away, but the space between me and the mirror seemed to stretch, the walls closing in. Couldn't breathe. "You can't escape," the collector whispered. "Not from this place. Not from me." The next morning, they found me standing in front of the mirror, frozen, my face pale and lifeless, my eyes wide in terror. The police thought I had just lost my mind, some kind of breakdown, but I knew the truth. The faces in the mirror, the collector, they had all been waiting for me, and now I was part of the collection. Now, let us venture further into the unknown. Story 5. I've always considered myself a skeptic, never one to believe in the supernatural or the inexplicable. I have my reasons, rooted in logic and reason. But there's something that happened to me that I can't explain, something that I've tried to forget. The problem is, you can never really forget a thing like that. Once you've seen it, once you've felt it, it stays with you forever, no matter how much you try to deny it. It began with the apartment. I had recently moved into a new place in the city, an old building that had a certain charm to it, even if it was a little run down. The rent was cheap and it was close to work, the kind of place most people would ignore, but I found it cozy in its own way. The floors creaked, the walls were thin, and the windows rattled when the wind blew, but it had character. I had been living there for a few months when I first noticed it. At night, as I lay in bed, I could feel it, the sensation of being watched. It started subtly, just a feeling deep in my gut, a quiet unease that I couldn't quite shake. But then it grew stronger. I'd wake in the middle of the night to the sensation of eyes on me. Cold, penetrating, unblinking eyes. I'd look around my room, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. No one. Nothing out of the ordinary. I chalked it up to stress, to the pressure of work, or maybe just the fact that I was adjusting to a new space. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it only intensified with time. One evening, after an especially long day, I came home to find something odd. The front door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it before leaving, but there it was, open by just a few inches. I paused in the doorway, a sense of dread pooling in my stomach. I didn't think anyone had broken in. Nothing appeared disturbed, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I pushed the door open fully, stepped inside, and locked it behind me. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the feeling of being watched lingered in the air like a heavy fog. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the unease gnawed at me. It was that night that I heard it, a tapping sound, soft, rhythmic, almost deliberate. At first, I thought it was just the building settling. The pipes groaned, the walls creaked. It wasn't unusual, but this tapping was different. It was precise, like someone was knocking. Not on the door, but on the walls or maybe the window. Couldn't quite tell. I lay still in my bed, straining to hear it. It came again, louder this time, the sound echoing in the silence of the room. Tap, tap, tap. It was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was outside my window. I turned to look, my heart racing. But when I reached the window and pulled aside the curtains, I saw nothing. Just the empty street below, the occasional passing car. No one there. I stood there for a moment, staring out into the night, trying to calm my breathing. Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I didn't know. But as I turned to walk back to my bed, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the window. There was a figure standing across the street, watching my apartment. I could see it just barely, its silhouette outlined in the dim streetlight, a shadow in the dark. I froze. The figure didn't move. It didn't blink. It simply stood there, staring directly at my window. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was looking at me. I quickly pulled the curtains shut and backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. Was it just a passerby? Someone out for a late-night walk? Or was it something intent on watching me? I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, eyes darting to every corner of the room, listening for any sound, any movement. But the rest of the night was still. The figure didn't return. The following days passed in a blur. I told myself I was being paranoid, that there was nothing to fear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was always watching me. It wasn't just at night anymore. During the day, when I would come home from work, I would check the windows, the locks, making sure everything was secure. But no matter how much I checked, no matter how careful I was, the feeling never left. And then one morning, I found something that stopped me cold. There, on my kitchen counter, was a single sheet of paper. It was simple, unmarked, no writing, no signature, nothing at all. Just a photo. I picked it up slowly, dread washing over me. It was a picture of my apartment building, taken from across the street. The same spot where I had seen the figure standing the other night. But what made my stomach twist was what was on the paper. In the bottom corner, almost hidden in the shadows of the building's exterior, a figure, the same figure I had seen standing outside my window, couldn't breathe. I stared at the photo for what felt like an eternity, but the figure didn't move, didn't disappear. It was there, standing in the exact same place, frozen in time. Someone had been watching me. They still were. And I realized, with horrifying clarity, that I had been marked. I never saw the figure again, but the feeling never left. I moved out of the apartment not long after that, leaving behind the building, the street, and the thing that had watched me. But no matter where I went after that, no matter how far I traveled, there was always that sense of eyes on me. It was only years later, after I had settled into another home, when I realized the truth. The watcher was still out there, and it was waiting for me to return. Story 6. I had always believed that there was a thin line between the living and the dead. That's what my grandmother used to tell me when I was younger. There's a veil, she would say, thin as a whisper, between this world and the next. You can feel it, but only when you're truly alone. I didn't believe her, of course. I thought it was just an old woman's tale, meant to spook me into behaving. But there was something about her eyes when she said it. Something heavy, something knowing. It always made me uncomfortable. I didn't think about it much as I grew older. Life had a way of demanding your attention, work, friends, the everyday hustle. But one evening, during a solitary walk in the woods near my home, I felt it. The veil. It was autumn, the air crisp and sharp, with the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. I liked walking in the woods at this time of year. when the world felt quieter, more peaceful. But that evening, something was different. The woods, usually so comforting, felt oppressive. The trees stood taller than usual, their twisted limbs reaching out like fingers, and the silence. It was too much. There were no birds, no rustling of animals in the underbrush, just a heavy, suffocating quiet. I kept walking, my feet crunching through the leaves, though every step felt like a small betrayal of the stillness around me. The path I normally took suddenly seemed unfamiliar, winding deeper into the forest than it ever had before. I tried to turn back, but the trees seemed to close in behind me. I was lost, or maybe I wasn't. Maybe I had always been meant to walk this path. That's when I saw it. A figure standing still in the middle of the path. It was just a shadow at first, blending in with the darkening woods. But as I drew closer, the figure became clearer. It was a woman. Her silhouette was blurred at the edges, her outline shifting, as though she was partially submerged in the air around her. She didn't move, but her presence was overwhelming. My heart raced, my breath quickened. Something about her felt wrong, out of place, but I couldn't look away. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling despite myself. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she stepped backward into the trees, her figure dissolving into the night as if she were never there. But she had been. I could feel the chill where she stood, a lingering cold that seemed to seep into my skin, crawling through my veins. I hesitated, standing frozen in the forest, unsure whether to follow or turn back. My feet moved on their own accord, drawing me deeper into the woods. My mind screamed at me to stop, but the pull of whatever I had just witnessed was too strong. I walked and I followed the path she had taken. The woods grew darker, the shadows heavier. The air felt thicker, like I was breathing through something other than air. I could hear the faintest whisper now, a low murmur, almost like a voice. It wasn't words, but it was something I could feel. It was pulling me forward, guiding me. Eventually, I stumbled upon a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a large, ancient stone archway, its edges covered in creeping ivy. The arch wasn't part of the natural landscape. It shouldn't have been there. It looked too old, too out of place. I felt the veil then, stronger than ever. The air around the arch was colder, the whispering louder. I stepped closer, mesmerized, and I swear I heard a voice then, a real voice, not a whisper. "Come through," it said. I couldn't help myself. I reached out and touched the stone, the surface rough and cool under my fingers. The moment I made contact, the air shifted, the whispering stopped, and everything fell silent. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath in front of me, despite the warmth of the autumn evening. And then, as if responding to a silent command, the archway began to glow. A soft light poured from the stones, warm but unsettling, casting long, twisted shadows across the clearing. I felt a pull deep and primal, the kind of pull you feel when you're standing on the edge of a great abyss, knowing you should turn back but unable to resist the call. Without thinking, I stepped through. I don't know how long I was gone. Time seemed to lose its meaning the moment I passed through that archway. When I emerged, I wasn't in the woods anymore. I was in a place I couldn't begin to describe. It was a world that felt half real, like a dream that clung to the edges of my consciousness. The sky was black, but streaked with light, swirling colors, unnatural and vivid, twisting in patterns I couldn't comprehend. The ground beneath my feet was solid, but it felt wrong, like I wasn't truly standing on it. And there, in the distance, were figures, dozens of them, watching. Some stood still, others moved slowly, their eyes fixed on me. Their faces were blurred, shifting, as though they were caught between two worlds. I tried to speak, but no words came out. My throat was dry, and my body felt heavy, as if it no longer belonged to me. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. The figures were drawing closer now, and in that moment, I realized what I had done. I had crossed the veil. I had walked into a world that wasn't meant for the living. The next thing I remember is waking up in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, a product of stress or too much time spent alone in the woods. But the feeling, the coldness, the whispers, they lingered, lingering on the edge of my mind, haunting me. Every now and then, I feel it again, the pull, the sensation of the veil brushing against me, trying to draw me back. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see the glowing archway, hear the distant whispers, feel the eyes of the figures watching me from the shadows. I don't know if I'll ever escape it, but I'm certain of one thing: the veil is real. Story 7. I didn't believe in curses. Not at first, anyway. People talk about them, sure, passing them off as superstition or folklore. But there's something about living with one that makes you question everything you thought you knew. Something about feeling its weight pressing down on your chest every waking moment. That's what it was like for me. Like a shadow you couldn't escape, no matter how hard you ran. It all started with the mirror. I had moved into a new apartment not long after a rough breakup. A fresh start, a change of scenery. The apartment was nothing special, small, a bit worn around the edges, but it had a certain charm. There was one feature, though, that caught my attention. In the hallway, just across from the bathroom, hung an old mirror. It wasn't anything extraordinary. The frame was a little tarnished, the glass slightly cloudy, but it had an elegance to it, something regal. I figured it had been there for years, maybe decades, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the building. I didn't think much of it at first. Just a mirror, after all. A simple reflection. But soon enough, it started to feel off. It wasn't obvious at first. It was subtle. A shift in the reflection that I couldn't quite place. You know that feeling when you look into a mirror and think you saw something move out of the corner of your eye? That's how it began. At first, I just assumed it was my imagination, the result of exhaustion or stress. But then, it happened again, and again. I'd walk past the mirror, and I would swear that I saw something different in the reflection. A flicker of movement, a shadow just out of place. It was always just for a split second, gone before I could fully process it. But it made my skin crawl, an unsettling chill that lingered long after I'd looked away. One evening, after a long day at work, I came home to find something I hadn't noticed before. The mirror was slightly ajar, its surface tilted as if someone had disturbed it. I froze, staring at the glass, a sick feeling crawling up my spine. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even looked at it that day. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold surface of the frame. As I did, the air seemed to grow colder. The room felt heavier, as if something was pulling at the very air around me. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just behind me in the reflection. At first, I thought it was my own image, my mind playing tricks on me. But no, this figure was different. It was taller, its features indistinct, but there was something hauntingly familiar about it. Something I couldn't put my finger on. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, but the room was empty. The figure was gone. I stood there, staring at the mirror, my breath shallow. My reflection stared back at me, perfectly still. But in my mind, I knew something had changed. Something had shifted, and I had just made contact with whatever it was. The days that followed were a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the mirror. Every time I walked past it, I felt drawn to it, my eyes unwillingly being pulled to its surface. It was as if something in the reflection was beckoning me, calling me closer, just out of reach. It didn't take long before I started seeing it more clearly. The figure, it was always there, standing just behind me in the reflection, watching me. This presence was so strong that it was impossible to ignore, impossible to pretend it wasn't real. I began to question whether I was losing my mind. Was it stress? Sleep deprivation? But no, it felt too real to be a figment of my imagination. I could feel its eyes on me, cold and distant, as though it was waiting for something. The worst part was the way it moved. Every time I looked away from the mirror and then looked back, the figure would be closer. A fraction of an inch at first, but it began to close the distance faster and faster. It wasn't long before the whispers started. It happened late one night, just as I was about to fall asleep. The house was still, the only sound the occasional creak of the old building settling. But then I heard it, a faint voice, barely audible, coming from the direction of the mirror. "Come closer." I froze, my blood running cold. It wasn't my own voice. It wasn't anything I recognized. But the voice had a tone, a luring quality that made my stomach twist. "Come closer." I felt it again, that pressure in my chest, the sensation of being watched, of being pulled toward the glass. It was like the mirror was alive, like it had become a living thing, a portal into something else. I tried to ignore it. I tried to cover the mirror, drape a cloth over it to block the reflection. But when I did, the whispers only grew louder, more insistent. I couldn't escape them. They were everywhere, inside my mind, inside the walls of the apartment. "Come closer." The next night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to confront whatever was in that mirror. It was either that or let it consume me. I stood in front of the mirror, my heart racing, my hands trembling as I reached out to touch the glass. The moment my fingers made contact, a jolt of cold shot through my body, and I heard the voice again, closer now, almost in my ear. "Come closer." I stepped forward, my reflection not following my movements. It was different now, the figure standing behind me, not just in the mirror, but inside the glass itself. It reached out, its long, shadowy fingers grazing my shoulder, and I could feel its touch, icy, numbing like death itself. I tried to pull away, but it was too late. When I woke up, I was no longer in my apartment. I was in the same hallway, staring at the same mirror. But the world around me was dark. There was no light, no warmth, just an endless black void. The reflection in the glass was mine, but it was different, hollowed out, drained of life. And standing just behind me, the figure was there again, its features clearer now, its eyes staring into mine with a hunger that sent a chill straight to my soul. It whispered one last time, a sound that echoed in the void. Now you're mine. I don't know how I returned. I don't know if it was real or if I'm still in that place. But the mirror is gone. I don't know where it went, but I haven't seen it since that night. The whispers have stopped, but the feeling is always there, lurking just out of reach. And sometimes when I look into a glass, I still see it, the figure standing just behind me, waiting. Story 8. There's a house at the edge of town, one that's always been a source of whispers. It's the kind of place people cross the street to avoid, the kind of house that makes children pause and look over their shoulders, even when they're far from it. It's been abandoned for as long as anyone can remember, though I'm not sure how much of it is true. People say things about it, but no one really knows for sure. I didn't believe the rumors either, until I saw the man in the window. It all started when I moved into a small, rented cottage on the outskirts of town. The cottage was far enough from the chaos of city life to feel peaceful, but close enough that I could make the occasional trip into town for work or supplies. The first few days were idyllic, quiet, and serene, the kind of place you could truly unwind. But there was something about the house at the edge of town. I'd passed it a few times when I went to the market, its dark silhouette standing against the sky like a black stain. The windows were boarded up, the door locked, the lawn overgrown with weeds. No one had lived there for years, or so I'd been told. It was the perfect kind of place for a ghost story, or so the locals said. They spoke in hushed tones about strange lights in the windows, eerie sounds at night, and rumors of an old man who used to live there, an eccentric who had vanished without a trace. I paid little attention. I was here to escape, not to indulge in gossip. But then, one night, I saw him. It was a chilly evening, the kind where the air bites at your skin and the sky is a deep, unsettling shade of purple. I had just finished dinner and was sitting by the fire, reading a book, when I glanced out the window. I don't know why I looked, but I did, and that's when I saw him. He was standing in the window of the old house, his face pressed against the glass. I could barely make out the details at first, just the shape of a man, tall, thin, with a hunched back, his face obscured by shadows. But there was no mistaking the way he stood there, unmoving, just staring. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know what to think. There was no way anyone could be inside that house. The windows were boarded up, the door locked, and I had seen it for myself when I passed earlier that day. I rushed outside, my feet crunching through the fallen leaves as I made my way toward the house. The closer I got, the more the feeling of unease crawled under my skin. The air grew colder, and the house seemed to loom larger, its broken windows staring down at me like hollow eyes. I reached the front gate and stopped. There was nothing, no man, no figure, just an empty, darkened window. I turned away, my heart still racing. I must have imagined it, I thought. It was late, I was tired, but I couldn't shake the image of that figure, his face pressed against the glass, watching me. The next day, I decided to visit the house again, this time in the daylight. I had to know if there was any truth to what I'd seen. I approached the house cautiously, walking slowly, keeping a safe distance. There was nothing unusual about the place during the day, just an old, abandoned house, like so many others. But then, I looked up at the window. And there he was again. This time he was standing just inside the glass, his eyes fixed on me. His gaze was piercing, cold, like he was staring straight into my soul. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my stomach. Something about his presence felt wrong, unnatural. I couldn't move. I stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure. Then, slowly, the man raised a hand to the window, his fingers brushing against the glass. It was a slow, deliberate movement, like he knew I was watching. And then, with a sudden jerk, he vanished. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my breath shallow, my mind racing. Was I going crazy? There was no way anyone could have been inside the house. No one had lived there for years, or so I thought. But there was something in the back of my mind that told me otherwise. Something that told me that the man in the window was real, that he had been watching me for far longer than I had realized. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I pulled the curtains shut in my cottage, locked the door, and turned off the lights, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. But the fear wouldn't leave, clung to me like an oppressive weight. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of the night. And then I heard it, a soft tap just outside my window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a tree branch brushing against the glass. But then it came again, a faint, deliberate tap. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I got up and walked to the window, my pulse pounding in my ears. I pulled back the curtain, my heart racing. And there, standing just outside, was the man. His face was inches from the glass, his cold, lifeless eyes locked onto mine. His mouth moved slightly, as if he was trying to say something, but I couldn't hear the words. I stumbled back, my legs weak, my breath catching in my throat. The man just stood there, staring at me with that same unblinking gaze. I turned away from the window, my mind reeling. What did he want? Why was he watching me? What did I do to deserve this? I didn't know, but I knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going away. The following morning, I packed my things. I couldn't stay in that cottage any longer. The fear, the constant feeling of being watched, it was too much. I couldn't shake the image of that man, standing in the window, staring at me. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for just a brief moment, I thought I saw him again. Standing at the edge of the woods, his eyes following me as I left. I never went back to that town, and I never will. But sometimes, when I'm alone in a room with a window, I feel it again. The feeling that someone is watching, just out of sight. I can't explain it, but I know that man is still out there somewhere, and he's still watching. Story 9. I've always been one for peace and quiet. When I decided to leave the bustling city behind and rent a small apartment in the countryside, I imagined a life of serenity. Quiet mornings, slow afternoons, and starry nights where the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. It was the perfect escape from the chaos that had overtaken my life. A fresh start. But peace, as I would soon learn, is never as simple as it seems. The apartment was a charming little place, tucked away on the edge of a sleepy village. It had high ceilings, creaky floorboards, and walls that seemed to groan in the night. The kind of place that whispered with history. I was drawn to its rustic charm, the old wooden beams that ran across the ceiling, the ivy creeping along the exterior. The rent was unbelievably cheap, which should have been my first warning sign. But I was too eager to escape the noise of my old life to think twice. From the moment I moved in, something was off. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. The air always felt a little too still, the shadows a little too deep. I chalked it up to the old age of the place, the natural creaks and groans that come with buildings settled into time. But as the days went by, I began to notice something I couldn't ignore. A sound. It started small, almost inaudible, just a faint tapping from somewhere deep within the walls. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, the way buildings sometimes shift as they age. But the sound persisted, always at the same time each night, just after the clock struck midnight. It was a steady rhythm, like something tapping against the inside of the walls. It wasn't an animal, I was certain of that. It wasn't wind either. The air was still, and the tapping seemed too deliberate, too methodical. At first, I told myself it was just the sound of pipes or the house settling. But as the nights wore on, the tapping grew louder. And then, it changed. One night, the tapping stopped. The silence in the apartment was suffocating. I sat up in bed, straining my ears, waiting for the familiar sound. But instead, I heard something else, a low, guttural echo. It wasn't a sound from the walls, nor from the floorboards. It was inside my own mind. I froze, my heart pounding. The echo seemed to resonate in my head, filling every corner of my consciousness, as if the very air around me was vibrating with a presence. It was almost like something was calling to me. I tried to shake it off, but the sensation lingered. The echo seemed to grow louder, more insistent, until it was impossible to ignore. I got out of bed and walked to the source of the sound, the old wooden door that led to the cellar. The echo seemed to emanate from beneath the floorboards. I couldn't explain it, but I felt compelled to go down there. The cellar was dark, the only light coming from a dim bulb hanging low from the ceiling. I had never ventured down there before. The landlord had warned me to leave it alone. The space was old, he said, and not in the best condition. I hadn't thought much about it until now, but as I descended the stairs, the air grew thicker, colder. The echo was louder down here, a pulsating rhythm that seemed to reverberate through my chest. At the bottom of the stairs, I saw something strange. An old wooden box, placed carefully in the center of the room. It wasn't there the last time I checked. I approached it cautiously, my heart racing. The echo seemed to be coming from the box now, the sound vibrating through the floor beneath my feet. I knelt down, my hand trembling as I reached for the lid. The moment I opened it, the echo ceased. For a long moment, everything was silent. I stared into the box, my breath caught in my throat. Inside was a tattered old journal, its pages yellowed with age. It was a strange thing to find in such a place, a relic from some forgotten time. I picked it up, my fingers brushing the worn leather cover. As I flipped through the pages, the words began to blur, as if they were shifting on their own. The writing was erratic, as though the author was in a hurry to record their thoughts. It was a series of incoherent ramblings, but one passage caught my eye. The echo never stops. It waits for you, in the walls, in the silence. Calls to you, beckons you to listen. To hear it is to understand its hunger. I felt a chill run down my spine. What did that mean? And why did it feel like the echo was still there, lingering just outside my hearing? I couldn't leave the journal behind, so I took it with me back to my apartment. But that night, as I lay in bed, trying to block out the unsettling thoughts, the echo returned. This time it was different. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence. The tapping, the low hum, the whispers, they all blended into one overwhelming sensation. I could feel the walls closing in, the floor shifting beneath me. The echo was inside me now, its rhythm pounding in my skull, in my heart. I pressed my hands to my ears, desperate to block it out. But no matter how hard I tried, the sound only grew louder. It filled the room, the entire apartment, until I felt like I was drowning in it. The next morning, I packed my things. I couldn't stay there any longer. The echo had taken over my mind, consumed my every thought. I couldn't ignore it, couldn't escape it. It was everywhere. As I left the apartment for the last time, I glanced back at the windows. The place looked the same as it always had, quiet, still, and empty. But deep down, I knew the echo was still there, waiting for the next person to listen, waiting for the next mind to crack. Story 10. It was an estate sale that brought me to the old manor at the edge of town. An unexpected invitation, really. My friend, Claire, had told me about it weeks before. A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to browse through the contents of a centuries-old mansion that had been abandoned for years. The property had been owned by a reclusive family, the Hawthorns, who had mysteriously vanished from the town decades ago. Their home, a sprawling Gothic structure, had stood empty ever since, collecting dust and rumors. Claire insisted we go. I, of course, was skeptical. What use was there in digging through the remnants of someone else's past? But there was something about the way she described the place, the faded grandeur of it, the intrigue that lingered around the family's disappearance, that pulled me in. I agreed to come along. The estate was just as eerie as Claire had described. Its once imposing gates were rusted and hanging crookedly on their hinges. The ivy had crept up the stone walls, and the windows, blackened by years of neglect, stared blankly into the overgrown yard. It looked as if the house itself had been abandoned by time, left to decay in silence. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of old wood. The estate sale was already in full swing, with a handful of people wandering through the dark hallways, examining old furniture, glassware, and paintings. Claire and I separated, each of us drawn to different corners of the manor, sifting through the forgotten treasures. It wasn't long before I found it. The portrait hung on the far wall of the study, the dark wood frame commanding attention against the faded wallpaper. It was an unsettling painting, a large, somber woman seated in a lavish chair. She was dressed in Victorian-era clothing, her face pale and expressionless. But it wasn't just her features that caught me. There was something about her eyes, dark, endless pools that seemed to follow me, even as I moved. I was drawn to it. The longer I stared, the more I felt an inexplicable pull. Something about the portrait was off. I took a step closer, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I heard Claire's voice calling from across the room, but I couldn't tear myself away. I reached out, my hand hovering just inches from the painting, drawn by an irresistible urge. And then, as if in response, the room grew colder. Claire's voice snapped me back to reality, and I quickly stepped away, shaking off the strange feeling that had settled in my chest. I told myself it was just the atmosphere of the house, the unsettling nature of its emptiness. But the unease remained, an undercurrent I couldn't shake. We left the manor that day with a few small mementos, but the painting stayed in my mind. I didn't understand why, but it haunted me. It wasn't until a few days later that I understood. I began to notice changes in myself. Small things at first, objects misplaced, things left where I hadn't put them. But it didn't stop there. The dreams began. At first, they were fleeting, just flashes of images. Dark corridors, a woman standing at the end, watching me. But as the nights wore on, they grew clearer, more vivid. I would dream of walking through the halls of the Hawthorne Manor, my footsteps echoing off the stone floors, the portrait of the woman always present, always watching. I could feel her eyes on me, even when I wasn't looking. But then the dreams started to change. I would find myself in the painting, standing where she once sat. Her gaze would never leave me, and I would feel her cold, invisible presence pressing in from all sides. And every time I woke up, it felt as if I had been suffocating, as if I had spent the night trapped in the frame, the woman's eyes never letting me escape. I told Claire about the dreams, but she dismissed them as nothing more than the lingering effect of being in such an unsettling place. "The house just gets to people," she said. "You were probably overwhelmed by it all. It'll pass." But it didn't pass. The more time I spent in my apartment, the more I felt like the woman from the portrait was there with me. It wasn't a physical presence, but something far more sinister. It was as if her eyes were on me, even when I couldn't see her. I would wake up to find the room colder, the shadows darker. I tried to distract myself, staying late at work, hanging out with friends, but nothing seemed to help. The dreams were constant, and the fear was growing. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape her. It wasn't long before I made the connection. The portrait, the woman in the painting. The longer I thought about it, the clearer it became. I was the one who had been drawn to it. I had lingered too long. I had reached out, and I had taken something with me. Desperate for answers, I began researching the Hawthorne family. The more I dug, the more I uncovered a chilling history. Stories of a curse that had plagued the family for generations. It was said that each Hawthorne heir was doomed to live a life of torment, their souls bound by an ancient pact made by their ancestor, a painter who had created the portrait of the woman. The woman in the painting was his wife, who had died mysteriously. It was said that her spirit lingered within the portrait, cursed to watch over the living and never be freed. But there was more. The curse didn't just trap souls, it demanded them, and I had unwittingly become the next victim. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't live like this any longer, with the painting's presence creeping into every part of my life. I had to return to the manor, to the very place I had first encountered the portrait. That night, Claire came with me. We entered the manor, the air thick with the scent of decay. We made our way to the study, where the portrait still hung, eerily silent in the dim light. I approached the painting, my hand shaking as I reached out for it once more. But this time, the woman in the portrait didn't just watch. She smiled. Her eyes gleamed with a hunger I hadn't seen before. I could feel the pull again, stronger than ever. Before I could stop myself, my fingers brushed the cold surface of the frame, and everything went black. I woke up outside, Claire standing over me. The manor was gone. The painting was gone. But the woman's face, her cold, hungry eyes, remained in my mind. Somewhere, deep within that cursed frame, she was still waiting. Story 11. I had never believed in the supernatural. Ghosts, spirits, curses. They were just stories people told to entertain or frighten one another. In my world, reality was far more tangible, far more grounded in what could be seen, touched, and understood. That was until the wind found me. It happened during a late autumn road trip. I was traveling through the small town of Elm Hollow, a place barely on the map, nestled between dense woods and towering cliffs. The kind of town you might pass through without a second thought, if not for the strange pull it had on travelers. I had no intention of staying there, but a sudden storm forced my hand. I pulled into a rundown in just as the skies opened, rain pouring down in sheets. The innkeeper, an elderly woman with a vacant look in her eyes, welcomed me in with an unsettling warmth. She was the only one there. "There's a storm coming," she had said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the wind here, well, it's something you should watch out for." I didn't think much of her words, assuming they were just part of the town's charm. But the inn was a strange place. The air inside felt still, as though it had been trapped for years, and the creaking floorboards echoed with every movement. The atmosphere was heavy, oppressive, and it had nothing to do with the storm outside. That night, as I lay in bed, the wind began to pick up. The walls of the inn groaned under its force, but it wasn't the storm that unsettled me. It was the way the wind sounded. It wasn't like any wind I had ever heard before. Carried whispers, soft at first, almost imperceptible, but slowly growing louder. They swirled in the air, curling into my ears, as if they were speaking directly to me. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks, my mind trying to make sense of the noise. But the more I listened, the clearer the whispers became. They weren't random gusts of air. They were voices, distant and hushed, as if they were trying to tell me something. I tried to ignore it, pulling the covers over my head, but sleep wouldn't come. The voices grew louder, and the whispers turned into words, urgent and pleading. "Leave before it's too late." The words felt like a warning, but I couldn't understand why the wind was speaking to me, or who it was. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, straining to listen, but the room was empty. The next morning, I tried to push the strange experience from my mind. The rain had stopped, the sun had come out, and the town seemed ordinary once again. But as I stepped outside to leave, the innkeeper stopped me. "Did you hear it?" she asked, her voice low and knowing. I nodded, unsure of what to say. "The wind," she continued, "it speaks to those it chooses. Be careful, traveler. Elm Hollow is not a place where the wind's whispers are harmless." I left the inn with a sense of unease gnawing at my gut. The town seemed smaller now, as if its streets were closing in on me. The whispers from the night before hadn't left me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, following me. As I walked through the town, I passed by the old church at the edge of the village. The wind seemed to pick up as I approached, pushing against me, as though trying to keep me from going further. I glanced up at the steeple and saw something strange, a dark shape standing at the top. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. The figure wasn't moving, but it was there, black and still, almost as though it was waiting for me. A voice in my head told me to keep walking. Don't look back. But I couldn't help it. I turned, only to find the figure was gone, replaced by a gust of wind that tore through the trees, sending a flurry of leaves scattering around me. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the hills, I heard the wind again. This time it was more persistent, as though it had something it needed to say. The whispers were louder now, frantic. It's too late now. You've heard us, and now we will find you. The voice was low, almost guttural, filled with a sense of dread. I ran back to my car, my breath coming in quick gasps, the whispers following me through the trees, growing louder with each step. I drove away from Elm Hollow in a daze, the wind still howling around me, its voice now a cacophony of frantic cries. I couldn't escape the feeling that something had followed me, that the whispers were not just in my mind but in the very air I breathed. That night, as I tried to sleep, the whispers returned, louder and more distinct. They weren't just warnings now, they were instructions. Come back. You must come back to us. I could feel their presence closing in, not just in my mind, but around me. The walls of the room seemed to close in on me, the air thick with something I couldn't name. I tried to leave the bed, but my body wouldn't move, paralyzed by an unseen force. The whispers were now screams, demanding my return. The wind, the whispers, they were not natural. They were the voices of something old, something bound to the town of Elm Hollow, and I had disturbed them. I had heard them, and now they were calling me back. The next morning, I left the town, the wind following me. I never looked back, but the whispers, they never stopped. Every gust of wind, every change in the air, I could hear them, soft at first, like a distant murmur, but always growing louder. The wind had chosen me, and no matter how far I ran, no matter where I went, I would never be free of it. The whispers of Elm Hollow would follow me always. Story 12. It was a house like any other. A modest 3-bedroom nestled in a quiet neighborhood at the edge of the city. But it wasn't the house itself that drew me in. No, it was the history behind it, or rather, the lack of history. When I moved in, I'd been told by the real estate agent that the previous owners had moved away abruptly. The house had sat vacant for months, awaiting a buyer. The air was thick with that peculiar silence that comes with unoccupied homes. No traces of the lives once lived there. No personal belongings left behind. It seemed as though everything had been wiped away, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for someone to breathe life back into it. At first, everything was ordinary. I unpacked my things, hung a few pictures on the walls, and settled into my new routine. But as the days wore on, I started to notice something off. It was the room at the end of the hallway, the one I'd never really paid much attention to. It was always locked. At first, I assumed it was just a storage space, something no one ever bothered with. But curiosity eventually got the best of me. The door was old, its paint chipped and faded, as though it hadn't been touched in years. There was no handle, just a small keyhole. I found a key buried deep in one of the boxes I'd yet to unpack. It wasn't labeled or marked in any way, just a simple brass key. I wasn't sure what it opened, but something about it felt important, like it had been waiting for me. One evening, after a long day at work, I decided to use it. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a room that had clearly been untouched for a long time. Dust hung thick in the air, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the corners. The room was small, with a single window that allowed very little light to seep in. But it wasn't the condition of the room that caught my attention. It was what was inside. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with objects that seemed entirely out of place. Old books, framed photographs, tarnished silverware, and a strange assortment of trinkets. But what stood out the most was the large, ornate mirror hanging on the far wall. It was tall, framed in dark wood, its surface cloudy and dull with age. I felt a strange pull as I approached the mirror, my hand instinctively reaching out to wipe away the dust. As I did, the reflection that stared back at me wasn't my own. It was different. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, the angle of the room, or the fact that I hadn't eaten much that day. But no, the reflection in the mirror wasn't me. It was a man, a tall, dark-haired man, standing just behind me, his face obscured by shadow. His presence was unmistakable. I could feel him in the room, even though I couldn't see him directly. I spun around quickly, my heart hammering in my chest. But the room was empty. I closed the door behind me and locked it, but the unease didn't fade. If anything, it only grew stronger. Every night since that moment, I found myself drawn back to that room, that mirror. I couldn't explain it. It was as if the reflection was calling me, beckoning me to return. And every time I looked into it, the man was there, his face still hidden in shadow. Sometimes he would move, shifting ever so slightly, as if trying to step out of the mirror. I couldn't tear my eyes away, couldn't look away even when my instincts screamed at me to run. One night, the whispers began. Soft at first, almost inaudible, but growing clearer with each passing day. "You have to let me out." I was terrified, but I couldn't stop myself from going back. The compulsion was too strong. The mirror, the man, they were pulling me in, and the more I resisted, the harder it became to ignore them. Then, on the third night after I had first unlocked the room, something changed. I went into the room as usual, but when I wiped the dust from the mirror, the man's face was no longer hidden in shadow. His features were sharp, defined. He was staring at me, his eyes cold and unblinking. His mouth was moving, though no sound came out. I leaned closer, my breath fogging up the surface of the glass. He was mouthing something, his lips forming words that I couldn't quite make out. But then, suddenly, the whispers returned, clearer than ever. "Let me out." I stepped back, my pulse quickening. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, suffocating. I reached out to touch the glass, but the moment my fingers made contact, I felt a jolt, a shock that ran through my entire body. It wasn't a physical pain, but something worse. It was as if I had crossed some invisible threshold, and the mirror was no longer just a reflection. It was a gateway. The man in the mirror moved again, this time more violently. His face twisted into a grotesque expression of rage, his mouth contorting into a silent scream. The whispers became screams of fury, demanding to be freed. I couldn't pull myself away. My hand was still pressed against the glass, and I felt something pulling me closer, drawing me into the reflection. For a moment, I was frozen, unable to move, unable to think. And then, without warning, I felt myself falling forward, my body shifting unnaturally. The world around me distorted, bending and warping as if the room itself were being consumed by the mirror. I woke up on the cold, hard floor of the room, gasping for breath. The mirror was no longer in front of me. The walls had changed. The shelves were gone, and the air felt damp and oppressive. I realized, with a sinking feeling, that the reflection had been real all along. I had stepped into the mirror, into a world that was not my own. The man had been waiting for me to cross over, and now that I could never go back. As I looked around the room, I saw him, standing just behind me, his face now clear, his smile wide and wicked. "You're mine now." Story 13. The strange how you can travel thousands of miles, yet still feel like you're going nowhere. The feeling crept up on me somewhere along the stretch of highway that cut through the desolate landscape, far beyond the reach of city lights and human company. I was driving home after a long, exhausting business trip, eager to get back to the comfort of my apartment, a place where I could finally rest. The roads were empty, the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were the last person on earth. It was just past midnight when the unease started, a subtle shiver that worked its way up my spine, but I couldn't pinpoint the cause. Maybe it was the long hours of driving or the isolation of the route. Perhaps it was the darkness that seemed to stretch forever, without a single flicker of light or sign of life. The first sign of something wrong came when I saw the car ahead of me. It was a beat-up sedan, moving at a crawl, the headlights dim and flickering. I didn't think much of it at first, just some tired traveler like me, dragging themselves through the night. But as I drew closer, I noticed the oddity. The car wasn't on the road. Not exactly. It was just off-center, positioned half on the shoulder, half on the actual lane. I honked my horn, hoping to alert the driver to the danger. No response. I slowed down, instinctively keeping my distance. But as I passed the car, I saw that the windows were rolled down, and the interior was empty. There was no one inside. Not a trace of life, except for the faint scent of something rancid that lingered in the air. I glanced around nervously, half expecting someone to jump out from the darkness, but nothing happened. The wind picked up, the road ahead stretched dark and endless, and I was left with a lingering sense of unease. For the next few miles, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights bearing down on me, but there was nothing. The road behind was empty. Still, the feeling gnawed at me, like a whisper at the back of my mind, telling me I wasn't alone. And then it happened. The radio, which had been silent for hours, crackled to life. At first, I thought it was just static, but then I heard it clearly, low, distorted voices murmuring through the speakers. I yanked the dial to turn it off, but the static only grew louder, the voices more distinct. It sounded like a conversation, but the words were muffled, almost incomprehensible, like they were coming from somewhere far away, just out of reach. I could barely make out what they were saying, but the tone sent chills down my spine. "He's almost there. Don't let him pass." I slapped the radio off, my heart racing, but the voices didn't stop. They were in my head now, swirling and echoing, growing clearer with each passing mile. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was the result of too much fatigue, but it didn't feel like that. The words were too real, too deliberate. Minutes, hours. It was hard to tell how much time had passed, but eventually, I saw something else in the distance. A sign. Or at least I thought it was a sign. As I approached, I could barely make out the faded letters. The words didn't make sense. They didn't belong to any town I knew. Next left. The last exit. I couldn't help but feel compelled to follow it. Some irrational part of my mind told me it would lead me to safety, to something familiar. So I turned. The road narrowed, winding through dense trees that swallowed up the light from my headlights. It felt like the world had closed in around me, the air growing colder, the shadows stretching long and unnatural. The voices in my head grew louder again, frantic now. You shouldn't have come this way. Turn back, turn back. But it was too late. I had already crossed into something else, something I didn't fully understand. I kept driving, hoping the road would eventually open up into something more familiar. But the trees seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive, and the path I was on no longer felt like a road. The pavement gave way to gravel, and the car bounced over uneven ground. I slowed down, trying to make sense of the situation, but the further I went, the more it felt like I was going in circles. And then, in the middle of the road ahead of me, I saw a figure. At first, it looked like a person, a shadowy silhouette standing motionless in the middle of the road. But as I drew closer, I realized that it wasn't a person at all. The figure was too tall, its limbs unnaturally long, stretching in grotesque proportions. Its features were obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its presence, like a heavy weight pressing down on me. I slammed on the brakes, but the car didn't stop, kept sliding, as if the road itself was pulling me toward the figure. My hands gripped the wheel, but I was helpless, caught in its grasp. And then, just as I was about to collide with the figure, everything stopped. The car came to a screeching halt, and the world fell silent. I looked around, expecting to see the figure standing before me, but it was gone. The road ahead was empty. The trees were still silent. I turned around, desperate to leave. But the road behind me had changed, too. There were no signs, no familiar landmarks, just endless darkness. I don't remember how long I drove after that. Time seemed to slip away, the hours blending together as the road stretched on forever. But I know this. I never made it home. I never found my way back. And somewhere out there, in the darkness, the road is still waiting. A long, endless path stretching toward nowhere. Story 14. It was just a normal Saturday night when it happened, or at least it seemed like any other. I had been staying at my cousin's house for the weekend, a break from my usual routine in the city. The house was old, nestled on the edge of a small town, surrounded by trees and the kind of quiet that feels almost too heavy to bear. It was a charming house, full of creaky floors and walls that whispered with the weight of time. My cousin had always joked about the place being haunted, but I didn't believe in such things. I chalked it up to the overactive imagination of a kid who spent too much time watching horror movies. But by the end of the weekend, I was no longer so sure. I had just finished dinner, and my cousin had gone upstairs to take a call, leaving me alone in the living room. I wasn't doing much, just flipping through a book, half listening to the hum of the house. The air was thick, heavy with an unsettling stillness. It wasn't a gust of wind or a strange sound that caught my attention first. No, it was the shift in the atmosphere, something subtle, like the very air in the room had become denser, heavier. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to fatigue. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. It was quick, a shadow darting across the hallway at the edge of my vision. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, maybe. But then I saw it again. A figure, thin and indistinct, moving slowly from one room to the next. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't take my eyes off the spot, half expecting someone to walk into the living room any moment. But no one did. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and took a hesitant step toward the hallway. The floorboards creaked beneath my weight, and I strained my ears for any sound, but the house remained unnervingly quiet. I approached the hallway, my heart thumping wildly in my chest. The door to the kitchen was ajar, and through the gap, I could see nothing but the dim outline of the room. I called out, hoping my cousin had come back downstairs, but there was no answer. The silence that followed felt wrong, oppressive. I walked closer to the kitchen, then to the stairs leading up. That's when I heard it. A soft, shuffling sound. It came from upstairs, faint but distinct. It wasn't just the floorboards creaking underfoot. It sounded like footsteps, but there was something odd about them, slow, uneven, dragging, like the person or whatever it was struggling to move. I called out again, louder this time, but my voice felt small, insignificant in the vast silence of the house. I took a step toward the staircase, then another, unable to shake the feeling that something was waiting for me upstairs. I hadn't heard my cousin's voice, no sound of movement, just that slow shuffle dragging closer, step by painful step. At the top of the stairs, I stopped. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I had to force myself to take a breath. The light from the hallway barely reached the top of the stairs, and the shadows stretched long, dark, and thick. And then, just as I was about to take another step, I saw it, a figure crouched near the door to my cousin's bedroom. The figure was tall, gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long. It was motionless, staring down at the floor as though it were waiting for something or someone. I couldn't move. My entire body was frozen in place, and I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. The figure didn't notice me. Its gaze remained fixed on the floor, its breath shallow, labored. For a moment, everything was still, as if the house itself had stopped breathing. And then, in an instant, the figure turned toward me. Its face was featureless. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin stretched taut over a skull. Its mouth opened in a grotesque imitation of a smile, revealing nothing but blackness. Couldn't make a sound. My body was rooted to the spot as the figure took a slow step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. The smell of decay hit me like a wave, the air growing cold and heavy as the thing drew closer. I backed away, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was trapped, caught in the suffocating grip of something beyond comprehension. The thing didn't seem to care. It was moving closer, its hollow, empty stare following my every movement. Then, just as it was almost within reach, it stopped. A soft whisper, barely audible, floated through the air. "You weren't supposed to see me. The words didn't feel like they came from its mouth. They echoed in my mind, as though the thing was speaking directly to me, bypassing my ears altogether. Suddenly, the figure jerked backward, its movements sharp and erratic. It disappeared into the darkness, as though it had never been there at all. The air felt lighter, and the oppressive weight lifted from the room. I rushed downstairs, heart still racing, my body trembling. I couldn't explain what had just happened, but I knew I wasn't alone in that house. Whatever it was, it had been watching me, waiting. My cousin came back down a short while later, completely unaware of the events that had just transpired. He didn't seem to notice the air was different, the unease that had settled like a thick fog in the house. I never told him what I saw, but I left that night, a strange chill still clinging to my skin. To this day, I wonder if I was ever meant to see that figure, or if it had been waiting for me all along. Story 15. I was alone in my apartment when I first noticed it. The light in the hallway flickered, the bulb dimming and flashing like a malfunctioning signal. It wasn't a typical problem with the electricity. The power wasn't going in and out, just the light pulsing with a strange rhythm. At first, I thought it was nothing, a minor glitch, but as the seconds passed, it began to feel wrong. I tried to ignore it, brushing off the growing unease creeping into my chest. After all, I had lived in this apartment for years, and I had never had any reason to believe it was anything more than an old, somewhat neglected building. But tonight it was different. The flickering of the light was almost hypnotic, as if it were trying to tell me something. I got up from the couch and walked over to the hallway, squinting into the dimness. The light above was still pulsing, now at a quicker rate, and I felt an unsettling pull toward it, a magnetic force I couldn't quite explain. I reached for the switch and turned it off, but the light didn't stop. It continued to flicker, the soft hum of electricity buzzing in my ears. I stared at it for a moment, confused. There was no reason the bulb should still be on if I had turned it off. And yet, there it was, lighting the hallway in an unnatural pattern, almost like it was breathing. I stood there watching it, waiting for something, anything to happen. The longer I stared, the more I felt the odd sensation that I wasn't alone. And then, just as quickly as it started, the flickering stopped. But it wasn't the same light. The hallway was suddenly darker, a deeper shade of shadow than it should have been. My pulse quickened as I stepped back, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. There was a sense of weight in the air now, a tension I couldn't explain. The apartment felt heavier, more oppressive. I decided to go to bed, hoping I was just imagining things. I tried to shake the odd feeling off, but as I lay in the darkness, I couldn't help but feel that something was watching me. Every creak of the floorboards below, every slight shift in the air, made my skin crawl. Hours passed, and I eventually drifted into a fitful sleep, only to wake up to the sound of something moving in the hallway. Soft steps, barely audible, but there. My heart thudded in my chest, and I pulled the covers tighter around myself, hoping it would just stop. But the sound grew louder, closer. It was the sound of footsteps, someone walking slowly, deliberately, across the hallway floor. The air felt colder now, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones and makes you feel like you're in the presence of something unnatural. I forced myself out of bed and crept toward the hallway, my breath shallow, my hand trembling as it reached for the doorknob. I opened the door cautiously, the faint light from the street lamps outside casting long shadows along the floor. The hallway was empty. I checked the light, but it wasn't flickering anymore. It was simply off as it should have been. But the oppressive weight in the air remained. The air felt stagnant, still as if time had stopped. Then I heard it again. The footsteps. But this time they were closer, so close I could feel them on the other side of the door. I backed away, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was it my imagination? Was I sleep deprived? But I could feel it, could sense it, the presence was real. Something was there, just beyond the door, waiting. I couldn't bring myself to open it again. Instead, I locked the door and sat against it, my heart pounding in my ears. The steps continued, slow and deliberate, circling the hallway just outside my room. They didn't stop, didn't falter. It felt like the person, if it even was a person, was waiting for something. Waiting for me. I spent the night like that, huddled in the corner of my room, too afraid to leave. The footsteps never stopped, only growing louder, closer, until they were right outside the door. And then, just before dawn, they suddenly ceased. The silence that followed was suffocating. My mind was numb, my body frozen in place, waiting for the next sound. But it didn't come. Eventually, I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I had to know what was happening. I forced myself to open the door, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty, bathed in the cold, sterile light from the overhead bulb that no longer flickered. I don't know what I expected to find, but as I stepped into the hallway, something cold brushed against my skin, like a finger tracing the back of my neck. I turned quickly, but there was no one. The door at the end of the hallway remained shut, its shadow looming in the dim light. I never stayed in that apartment again. I packed my things, left without a second thought, and moved out the very next day. I never found out what it was, whether it was the house or something else entirely. But I knew one thing, whatever it was, it hadn't wanted me to leave. Story 16. I moved into the old house on Maple Street when I was young, just a teenager. The house was large, its dark wooden frame towering above the street like something out of a forgotten time. My parents had bought it for a fraction of what it was worth, the price too good to pass up. The previous owners had left in a hurry, which no one seemed to question, as it was in a quiet neighborhood where nothing unusual ever happened. But the house, with its winding hallways and rooms that seemed to stretch on forever, had a way of making you feel like something was always just out of sight, just out of reach. It was in the basement that I first found it. I was exploring the house one afternoon, trying to figure out where everything went, when I came across the door hidden beneath the stairs. I had seen it before, of course, but I'd never paid much attention to it. It was just another forgotten door, one of the many in the house. But today, something about it caught my eye. The door was small, narrow, and old. The handle was tarnished, covered in dust, and the wood around it was warped, like it had been neglected for years. Something about it felt different, like it was hiding something, or perhaps keeping something trapped inside. I stood in front of it for a moment, my hand hovering over the handle. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something waiting for me behind that door, something that had been waiting a long time. I twisted the handle and pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in protest. Beyond the door, The basement was darker than I expected. The light from the stairs barely illuminated the space, and I had to step down into the shadows to see more clearly. It was a small room, barely big enough to turn around in. But in the center of the room was something that immediately drew my attention. A large, antique mirror, its surface dusty and cracked, standing tall against the far wall. I don't know why, but I couldn't look away from it. The mirror felt off. It wasn't just the way the light seemed to bend around it, casting strange reflections in the dark. It was something about the way it made me feel, like I was being drawn into it, like I was seeing something I wasn't supposed to see. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The closer I got, the more the air around me seemed to thicken, the shadows in the room stretching unnaturally. I stared into the glass, watching as my reflection slowly came into focus. But it wasn't just me. In the reflection, there was something else. A figure, standing just behind me, its face hidden in the darkness. I spun around, but the room was empty. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. My reflection was still there, but now it was different. The figure behind me was closer, standing just inches away, its presence so real I could almost feel its breath on the back of my neck. I backed away from the mirror, heart racing, but the reflection didn't move with me. It stayed, staring at me, its form growing more defined in the glass. I couldn't tear my eyes away, even though every instinct in me screamed to run. Suddenly, the figure's face became clearer. It was pale, its features distorted, as if its skin had been stretched too tightly over its bones. Its eyes were dark voids, empty and hollow, yet somehow I could feel them, watching me, waiting for me to do something. I reached for the door, desperate to leave, but before I could make it, the reflection in the mirror shifted. The figure in the glass moved, its hand reaching out toward me, its fingers stretching as though they were trying to grab me. I felt a cold, clammy hand close around my wrist, and I screamed, yanking my arm back. I turned and ran, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I didn't stop to look back, didn't stop until I was upstairs, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't explain what had just happened. The fear, the feeling that something was watching me, it had been so real. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew it wasn't. That mirror, whatever it was, had wanted me to see it, wanted me to know that something was there, something that had been waiting for a long time. I never went back to that basement. Couldn't. But no matter where I went in the house, I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing on my chest. It followed me, lurking just outside my line of sight, waiting for the moment when I would be too weak to resist. Eventually, we moved out. My parents never knew what happened, and I never told them. I didn't have to. I could still feel that cold hand on my wrist even now, years later. But I can't forget the look on that figure's face. Its dark, empty eyes staring at me from the mirror, waiting. Story 17. I had always been curious about the old house. It had stood there for years on the edge of town, its windows like hollow eyes staring out into the overgrown yard. The locals spoke of it often, but never in detail. There were rumors, whispers in the wind, about a room in the house, a room that no one dared enter. It was the kind of place that children dared each other to approach, but no one ever seemed to go beyond the cracked stone wall that separated the house from the rest of the world. The house had been abandoned for as long as I could remember, but something about it called to me. It wasn't just the mystery, it was the way it seemed to pull at me, like I had forgotten something, something important, something buried deep within that house. I first found the house when I was exploring the woods behind my childhood home. The forest was dense, and the trees twisted in strange angles, as if the land itself had been warped over time. But then, through the thicket, I saw it, the house. It wasn't much to look at, just a crumbling structure of gray stone and rotting wood. But there was something in the air around it, something heavy, as if the house itself held a secret, a memory long buried. My heart raced as I approached the house, an odd mix of fear and excitement swelling in my chest. The door creaked open as if welcoming me, and I stepped inside, the dust in the air settling like a forgotten memory. The place smelled of mildew and rot, but there was a strange sense of familiarity to it, like I had been here before, in some distant, forgotten time. I wandered through the house, drawn by an unseen force. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet, and the walls seemed to whisper to me, murmuring secrets in a language I couldn't quite understand. As I moved deeper into the house, I found the rooms faded with time, furniture covered in tattered sheets, paintings that had long since lost their color, and mirrors that reflected nothing but darkness. But then I found it. At the end of a narrow hallway, hidden behind a broken door, was a room that didn't belong. The door was barely hanging on its hinges, the wood rotting away, but the room beyond was different. It was untouched by time, pristine, as though it had been frozen in a moment. The air was still in there, thick with a kind of tension that made my skin crawl. I stepped inside, the floor beneath me creaking with each hesitant step. The room was small, but it felt endless, stretching in ways I couldn't quite grasp. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with old, faded books and objects that looked oddly familiar, like pieces of a dream. At the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror, its frame carved with intricate designs that seemed to twist and change when I looked away. It was polished, almost too polished, as though it had been cleaned obsessively, its surface reflecting nothing but the room itself. I approached it, unable to resist the pull. My reflection stared back at me, but there was something wrong with it. The room behind me seemed to distort, its edges bending and twisting unnaturally in the glass. I reached out to touch the surface, my fingers grazing the cool glass. That's when it happened. A cold gust of wind rushed through the room, though the window was closed. The shelves rattled, the mirror flickered, and for a moment, I could see something, someone, standing just behind me, reflected in the glass. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the room was empty. No one was there. But when I looked back at the mirror, my reflection wasn't the same. It was distorted, twisted, like a shattered version of myself, its eyes wide with fear. Then it smiled, couldn't breathe. My legs felt weak beneath me, and the room began to spin. The reflection in the mirror moved independently of me, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was trying to break free from the glass. I backed away, but my reflection didn't follow me. Instead, it stayed there, grinning, its eyes now full of malice. I ran through the house, the walls closing in around me, the whispers growing louder. The air became thick, suffocating. I reached the door, but it wouldn't open. My hand slammed against the wood, but it wouldn't budge. The house itself seemed to be alive, holding me there, keeping me from leaving. Behind me, I could hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the house. I turned, heart racing, but there was no one. The silence was deafening, and yet the footsteps continued, closer and closer. I don't know how long I was trapped in that house. Time seemed to lose all meaning. It was as if the house itself had been waiting for me, waiting for the moment when I would step into that room and awaken something that should have stayed forgotten. Eventually, I escaped. I don't remember how. My mind was foggy, clouded by the fear and the whispering that followed me out of the house. But now, even as I sit here writing this, I can hear it. The footsteps, slow, steady. They're just behind me, and no matter how hard I try to forget, I know that the house is still out there waiting for me to come back. Story 18. I never believed in ghosts, not until I moved into the old apartment on Broad Street. It wasn't much, just a small one-bedroom with creaky floors and walls thin enough that you could hear your neighbor's every word. But the rent was cheap, and that's what mattered. I had recently moved to the city, looking for a fresh start, and this place seemed like as good a place as any. The first few days were uneventful. The apartment felt lonely, like it had been empty for far too long. The air was stale, and the faint smell of something old lingered in the corners, but I shrugged it off. It was nothing, just an old building settling into itself. At least it was mine, and that was enough. But then, on the third night, I heard it. I was in bed, half asleep, when a sound broke through the quiet. At first, I thought it was just the usual noises of an old building. Pipes creaking, the wind rattling the windows. But this sound was different. It was soft, almost like a whisper, but it came from somewhere behind the wall. A voice, low and distant, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. It sent a chill down my spine, and I lay there, frozen, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But it wasn't. The next night, the voice returned. It was clearer this time, as if the speaker was just on the other side of the wall, close enough that I could almost make out the words. The sound wasn't frightening at first, more like a murmur, something you could easily ignore if you wanted to. But as the days went on, it became more persistent, more insistent. It wasn't until the fifth night that I finally got up to investigate. I stood in the hallway, my heart racing in my chest. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the edges curling up like the pages of a forgotten book. The sound was coming from the apartment next door, or so I thought. But when I knocked on the door, there was no answer. I tried again, but still nothing. The hallway was empty, silent, as if no one had lived there for years. I turned to the wall, my hand pressing against it. The voice was still there, muffled, like it was just on the other side, waiting for me to listen. I could feel the coldness of it, the way it seeped into my bones, and I knew that something wasn't right. The following night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing it, the voice growing louder, more frantic. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a scream, a plea, an echo of something lost. And then, for the first time, I heard my name. "Help me, Sarah." I froze. My heart stopped in my chest. How could it know my name? There was no one else here. No one else knew who I was. I rushed to the window, my hands trembling as I opened it wide. The night air rushed in, sharp and cold, but the voice didn't stop. It was still there, just behind the wall, but now it was closer, more urgent. I pressed my ear against the wall, hoping to understand, to make sense of what was happening. "Please, help me," the voice begged. It was so close now, so close that I could feel it. I could feel the desperation, the fear. It felt like it was coming from the very air around me, surrounding me, suffocating me. Couldn't breathe, couldn't think. And then, in the silence that followed, I heard a thump. It wasn't loud, just a soft, hollow sound, but it came from within the wall. I stepped back, heart hammering, my mind racing. The thump was followed by another and another. Then the sound of scratching, scraping, as if something was trying to break free from inside the wall. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and returned to the wall. I couldn't just sit there, couldn't ignore it. Something was wrong. Something was trapped inside, and I needed to know what it was. With trembling hands, I pressed the knife into the wall, scraping it along the peeling paint. The sound of the knife against the wood was deafening in the silence, but I didn't care. I had to get inside. I had to see what was on the other side. The wall split open easily enough. It was as if the building itself was willing to let me see what had been hidden. I tore away the rest of the wallpaper, pulling at it with desperation. And then I saw it. There, behind the wall, was a small door. It was old, rusted, and locked, but it was unmistakable. It was the source of the voice. The door was calling to me. I don't know why I opened it. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps it was the feeling that if I didn't, the voice would never stop. But when I opened the door, I saw nothing. Nothing except for the darkness. It was an endless void that stretched out before me, cold and empty, like a wound in the fabric of reality itself. The voice, still faint, echoed from within, and I could feel it pulling me in. I stepped closer, my feet moving on their own, drawn by the darkness, by the call. That's when the door slammed shut behind me. Now, I don't know what's real anymore. I've been here for days or maybe weeks. Time doesn't make sense in this place. All I know is the voice. It's still here, whispering to me from the dark, just waiting for me to help it, to pull it free. And no matter how hard I try to leave, the door won't open. The voice is inside me now. I can hear it in my head, feel it in my bones. It's a part of me, and I am a part of it. There is no escape.